Chris Cornell. 7 major mistakes. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for geniuses like this person who did this piece of work that I'm about to share. Forgive us our sins. We acknowledge your Son, Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, people, someone left a comment the other day on one of my videos about this man's work, Vernon J. Geberth. And I thought it was very interesting and I wanted to share it with you. And also, someone that works on this case very hard every day reminded me that they had sent me this a while back and I neglected to share it with you. So I'm going to share it now. I meant to share it yesterday as it was the anniversary of something very terrible that happened to this person that works very hard. And I really wish I could have gotten to it yesterday, but I didn't. That's my fault. Anyway. Oh, and I want to say to that person, and they know who they are, that sent me this a while back, I'm very sorry for your loss, and I appreciate every bit of work you do and how you've been watching my back all this time. Thank you for that. It's called The 7 Major Mistakes in Suicide Investigation. Looks like this. Now, does it completely apply to the deaths we talk about? No. Because I personally believe the deaths we talk about, there was contrivance, possible payoffs, sinister hands involved, if you will. But let's take a look. Again, The 7 Major Mistakes in Suicide Investigation by Vernon J. Geberth, MS, MPS, Homicide and Forensic Consultant. So if nothing else, this will be a nice forensic lesson for us. Death investigation is a complicated process which involves a number of different members of the police department as well as other forensic disciplines working together towards the goal of solving the case. If the goal is indeed solving the case, right? Not in these cases we talk about. They just call it suicide. Sweep it under the rug. Anyway, there may very well be miscommunications which result in serious errors that affect the outcome of the case due to the various responsibilities, uniform officers, detectives, medical examiners, to forensic experts, prosecutors, as well as others in the process. This is especially true in the investigation of suicide. And let me say this before I continue. Suicides have never been faked before, right? We're all crazy here, right? No one's ever killed someone and then attempted to make it look like a suicide so they don't go to fucking jail the rest of their life, right? That's never happened. That's sarcasm for those of you that can't detect it. Mistake number 1. Assuming the case is a suicide based on the initial report. And before I continue, just that title alone, just in case, based on initial reports, you decided, oh, it's suicide. You still might want to send test samples in, just in case. That's if you're really looking for the reason the person died and you didn't receive a payoff. If the case is reported as a suicide, the police officers who respond, as well as the investigators, automatically tend to treat the call as a suicide. Interesting. It is a critical error in thinking to handle the call based on the initial report. The immediate problem is that psychologically one is assuming the death to be a suicide case, when in fact this is a basic death investigation, which could very well turn out to be a homicide. The investigator cannot assume anything as a professional law enforcement officer. Indeed. Any preconceived theories or notions are dangerous in professional death investigation. In addition to errors of assuming a suicide or natural death, other preconceived notions may include deaths which appear to be drug-related and or domestic violence. One must keep an open mind and not be influenced either by the initial reports or the presentation in the crime scene. The phrase drug-related, they've tried to push that on us. They even gave Chris Cornell some type of opiate blocker, just assuming he was a hardcore addict because of the word of a mercenary, Martin Kirsten, and the word of his shitty wife, Vicky. Unfortunately, the tox later done by a real medical expert proved that Chris wasn't an addict. He hardly had any drugs in his system. Nothing of any high levels that would indicate him being an addict. So was this drug related in the Cornell case? No. Chester Bennington case? No, half a beer. Anthony Bourdain? No. Nothing in his system except therapeutic doses of a non-intoxicant. One must keep an open mind and not be influenced either by the initial reports or the presentation in the crime scene. Isn't the presentation, that word presentation, isn't that a great word, especially for the Cornell situation? Who could have presented that scene to us or made it a presentation? Possibly Martin Kirsten? Possibly, I don't know, just a random theory. Case history. As a homicide commander, I recommend that a detective respond to every unattended death scene, whether it was reported as a homicide, suicide, accident, or natural, to assure that any potential crime scene and or evidence surrounding the event was not disturbed. I recall responding to a reported suicide at a construction facility and arriving as the uniformed officers were removing the victim's wallet from his pants pocket as the body hung from an electrical appliance with a cord. I asked them what they were doing, and they replied that they were getting his identification so they could write up the suicide report. I asked them how they knew it was a suicide. They told me they got the call of a suicide, and when they arrived, they saw the man hanging by his neck and assumed he had hung himself. Oh, so since it was called in as a suicide, it must be a suicide. Sounds like Weaver to me. I advised the two officers that they were not in a position to assume anything and that a request for detectives to respond in fact meant that this was a crime scene. The following is the protocol for the initiation of an effective crime scene investigation. 1. Rapid response to the homicide crime scene by patrol officers. This is imperative in order to protect evidentiary materials before they are destroyed, altered, or lost. Anything and everything should be considered as evidence. Whether this evidence is physical or testimonial, it must be preserved, noted, and brought to the attention of the investigators. The only evidence collected at this point of the investigation is eyewitness accounts or spontaneous statements of a suspect at the scene. After the scene is secured, immediate and appropriate notification must be made to the homicide investigators. In other words, when the patrolmen get there, they should just be roping shit off and taking statements. Not touching shit, not walking all over the scene, nothing like that. That's for detectives and investigators to do. And hopefully that detective or investigator didn't receive a payoff. My preliminary, there are actual pictures of this scene. And I'm going to show it, even though it's kind of graphic. Those are the pictures. I'm not going to enlarge each one. Underneath that one picture, looks like to the left of the screen, it says, note the piece of vegetation caught in the man's hair. My preliminary observation indicated that the suicide, and that's in quotes, was actually a homicide and that someone had effectively staged the scene to make it appear to be a suicide. So here's a professional investigator talking about how a suicide scene is staged for our benefit. So a motherfucker don't go to jail for the rest of their fucking life. So to presume that the Cornell scene, the Bennington scene, the Bourdain scene couldn't be a staged scene, you're a fucking moron if you presume that. Because somebody don't want to go to jail. It's very possible, and here's the evidence that it's possible and that it's been done before. That a suicide has been staged. A hanging, literally, has been staged. I saw a piece of vegetation caught in the man's hair that did not come from the location. I also noticed dirt on his pants, which later analysis revealed that it did not come from the area. Well, that's why you send test samples in, huh? Even though it appears to be a suicide at first. Because it would show that that dirt wasn't from that location, that vegetation wasn't from that location. And I'm talking to you, Mr. Weaver. Directly to you. That's why you sent samples in, but I know why you didn't. Had nothing to do with incompetence. Allegedly, of course. The man had been strangled to death at another location and then transported to the construction site where he was strung up with the electrical cord to make it appear to be a suicide. The initial responding officers, as well as the ambulance crew at the scene, were ready to declare the death as a suicide and were preparing to transport the body to the morgue. They didn't even have to look at ligature marks or anything like that. Dirt from another scene. Vegetation from another scene. Didn't even have to get to the point where they're examining marks on the neck yet. This is the reason why test samples should be sent in, Mr. Weaver. Mistake number 2. Assuming the suicide position at the crime scene. It has been my experience that when police officers or detectives hear the word suicide, they go into what I describe as the suicide position. Suicides are non-amenable offenses that are not recorded in the UCR and therefore are considered less important than other events. Without a doubt, investigators take shortcuts when they hear the word suicide. They do indeed, don't they? Like not sending test samples in. Like doing a half-ass questioning of a mercenary who was the last person to see someone alive. I have reviewed many suicide cases where it is apparent that the investigators did not take each point to its ultimate conclusion, like sending test samples in, right? Sufficient photographs were not taken, and certain tests were not conducted or not sent in. In some instances, the deaths were suicides, but the incomplete and insufficient preliminary investigation raised legitimate concerns. Death investigations of the elderly are oftentimes assumed to be naturals. There is a tendency on the part of uniforms and detectives to rush through the crime scene process. Rush through it, huh? Many investigators who have bought into the initial call and treated the case like a routine suicide or a natural death have been greatly embarrassed when the medical examiner's findings showed the death to be a homicide. They then find themselves in the unenviable position of having to explain how they missed crucial evidence or failed to take important crime scene photos. Or they just go on a Detroit news, they go to a Detroit newspaper and say, we didn't send the tests in because it's a suicide. They just don't even bother. Case history. A sheriff's department was called to respond to a suicide in a residence. The responding deputy asked the husband what had transpired. The husband told the deputy that he and his wife were having some marital problems and they were in the process of separating, and that his wife was thinking about committing suicide. Based on what the husband told him, the deputy stated in his report, it appears the deceased was despondent over her marriage and had threatened to commit suicide. She went into the bathroom closet, put a pillow over her head, and appeared to have shot herself in the head area. Put a pillow over her own head before she shot herself. Does that sound like bullshit to you? And you're going to take the husband's word on that? Yeah, we were having marital problems. She just decided to kill herself. Pathetic. Pathetic. It's one of the first questions cops ask if a spouse is dead. They ask the other spouse, Were you guys having marital issues? Was there an argument this evening? One of the first questions. Do you expect the other spouse to admit that? Most likely they won't. So I am surprised this person even admitted they were having marital problems. But the second he admitted that to me, if I was an investigator, I would have been suspicious right there. The second I saw the person put a pillow over their own head and then shot themselves, I would be suspicious there as well. But that's just me. The detective did not. My review of this case indicated the investigator was just going through the motions of an investigation. Going through the motions, that's interesting. That reminds me of the Cornell situation. The detective did not properly document the crime scene. He removed the gun before it was photographed and disturbed the original crime scene. The detective's report did not contain any independent observations. The detective did not conduct any interviews of the victim's family or friends, nor did he look into the victimology. The detective basically repeated what the first officer told him and then constructed an expedient conclusion. He classified the case as a suicide. A coroner's inquest later ruled that the death was a homicide. If the camera shuts off, I'll continue this in a part 2. I recommended that an investigator be assigned, mistake number 3, not handling the suicide as a homicide investigation. According to practical homicide investigation, all death inquiries should be conducted as a homicide investigation until the facts prove differently. The resolution of the mode of death as suicide is based on a series of factors which eliminate homicide, accident, and natural causes of death. I recommend that an investigator be assigned to every unattended death case. Some agencies have mistakenly allowed patrol officers to conduct basic death investigations with the assumption that such deaths are generally not criminal incidents and don't require detective investigation. On the contrary, these cases may very well be homicides, which have been staged to appear to be suicide, accidents, or natural causes. In equivocal death investigations, there is the potential for major errors. If in fact the death is later attributed to be a homicide, valuable evidence will have been lost or contaminated because the scene was not handled as a homicide case. The critical interviews and interrogations, as well as crime scene documentation and photographs, are irretrievable or just never sent in. Currently, with all the forensic programming available to the general public, which focuses on police procedure and forensic medicine, many people have come to believe that they are well versed and knowledgeable to the point that we have the CSI effect. The CSI effect refers to the phenomenon of the impact that the crime scene and forensic criminal investigation television shows on the general public. The fictional aspects of these programs provide the entertainment component. However, there are a number of legitimate investigative techniques, as well as tactical police procedures revealed to the viewing audience that contribute to the CSI effect. The problem is that criminals read the same books and watch the same TV shows as everyone else, and therefore gain insight into the investigative process, as well as the value of trace evidence. It is not unlikely that someone who wanted to kill might stage the scene to make a death appear to be a suicide to cover up the murder. Let me read that first part again. It is not unlikely. For all the jagoffs out there that want to call people crazy and conspiracy theorists, it is not unlikely, and this is from a professional investigator that doesn't appear to take payoffs. Case history. An actress living in a New York City apartment was discovered hanging by her neck. An actress, mind you. A famous person. From the shower curtain rod in her bathroom. Always the bathroom. The case was reported as a suicide by the person discovering her body, and the initial police officers had reported the case as a suicide when they notified detectives to respond. When the detectives arrived, they examined the room and the body of the victim and observed an antemortem injury to her face and noticed a Reebok sneaker print on the edge of the tub and the toilet seat. The woman was barefooted and could not have caused that impression. The crime scene detectives lifted the footwear impression as a piece of evidence as the detectives conducted their canvass of the apartment and questioned the victim's relatives and friends. Basically, they determined the victim did not fit any suicide profile and the death was in fact suspicious. Let me say this: someone found drowned in their bathtub could have easily had a hand on their chest holding them down. Who just recently drowned in their bathtub? I want to remind people of that when they call people crazy, and conspiracy theorists as well. May not be what it appears. Detectives learned that a 19-year-old Ecuadorian construction laborer who had been working in the adjoining apartment had gotten into a verbal dispute with the victim over the noise that he was making, and angry words had been exchanged earlier that same day. The construction worker had left the apartment shortly thereafter and failed to notify his foreman. When the detectives located him in a friend's residence, he admitted that he had killed the woman by strangling her, and then cleverly staged the scene by hanging her from the shower curtain rod top, making it appear that she had committed suicide. In order for him to lift her into that position, he had to stand on the edge of the tub and toilet seat, therefore leaving several footwear impressions which matched his Reebok sneakers. Mistake number 4. Failure to conduct victimology. One of the most significant factors to consider in any death investigation is victimology. Victimology, as it pertains to both suicide and homicide investigations, is significant in ascertaining motives, suspects, and risk factors. In suicide cases, this becomes paramount in determining motive and intent. Does the victim fit a suicide profile? Like, are they withdrawing? Have they canceled appointments? Do they not want to see friends and family? I don't know, that's just my thoughts. I just threw that out there. Was there any evidence of marked depression or suicide ideations? Did the victim have both short and long-term plans? Basically just what I said. I know someone that had short-term plans. The day they died, a guy named Chester Bennington. He's supposed to be at an appointment that he didn't cancel. And then he's dead. Victimology is the collection and assessment of all significant information as it relates to the victim and his or her lifestyle. Personality, employment, education, friends, habits, hobbies, marital status, relationships, dating history, sexuality, reputation, criminal record, history of alcohol or drugs, physical condition, and neighborhood of residence are all pieces of the mosaic that comprise victimology. The bottom line is, who was the victim and what was going on in his or her life at the time of the event? The best sources of information will be friends, family, associates, and neighbors, and that will be the initial focus of the investigation. Or the last person to see him alive. And as far as Bennington for a moment, is there any record of him really trying to kill himself? At any point in his life? Besides the 2 bullshit stories by Talinda that he jumped in a pool after he hogtied himself? Or that he left the house with a gun? Those aren't suicide attempts. That's a joke. Mistake number 5. Failure to apply the 3 basic investigative considerations to establish if the death is suicidal in nature. The investigator should be aware of 3 basic considerations to establish if a death is suicidal in nature: the presence of the weapon or means of death at the scene, injuries or wounds that are obviously self-inflicted or could have been inflicted by the deceased, the existence of a motive or intent on the part of the victim to take his or her own life. Injuries or wounds? How about 9 rib fractures? Nah, that was a CPR, right? Never mind. The weapon. The weapon or means of death should be present in cases of suicide. However, the absence of a weapon does not necessarily indicate that death was due to a homicide. The weapon could have been stolen or otherwise disposed of prior to the arrival of authorities, as seen in the case of the heirloom handgun. Furthermore, family members have been known to conceal weapons and/or suicide notes in order to collect on an insurance policy. Wounds. Injuries and wounds in suicides may be very similar to those observed in homicides. However, certain observations that the wounds found on the body are consistent with homicide or suicide should be made. For example, a person found dead from multiple stab wounds of the back would certainly not be considered a victim of suicide. Likewise, in suicide cases, there appear to be preferences and avoidances for certain parts of the body. The investigator should have an appreciation for the lethality of the wounds. Remember, it's not the number of wounds that are self-inflicted, but the lethality of these wounds and what particular organs have been impacted. Could the deceased cause the injuries and death? Was the person physically able to accomplish the act? Are the wounds within the reach of the deceased? Are the wounds grouped together? Is there more than one cause of death? Are there any hesitation marks or wounds? Describe the nature and position of the of the injuries. Motive or intent. The manner of death may be important in determining suicidal intent. People who hang themselves or jump to their deaths certainly have indicated an intention to take their lives. Similarly, deaths that involve a combination of methods, such as poisoning, shooting, slashing of wrists, inhaling gas, etc., show an extreme desire to die. Obtain background information, medical and social. Were there any warning signs? Were there any recent deaths in the family? Any indication of recent upset or stress? Did the victim leave a suicide note? Has deceased been under professional treatment or counseling? Had the deceased ever attempted suicide in the past? Has anyone in family ever committed suicide? Mistake number 6, failure to properly document any suicide notes. Well, there were none in the 3 cases I talk about. If the victim left a note, and even if you are sure that the case is suicide, obtain an exemplar, an example of the victim's handwriting from some document that was known to have been written by the deceased. This is necessary especially when later on there is dispute over the classification of the death as a suicide. In the instance of Cobain, the alleged suicide notes seem to be 2 different handwritings, 2 different kind of moods and themes. But we all know why that is, don't we? The presence of a suicide note certainly suggests suicide. However, there are a number of investigative considerations to determine whether or not the note is genuine or real, not written by someone else. Was it written by the deceased? Was it written voluntarily? People have been forced in the past to write a suicide note, so it comes out in their own handwriting. Probably under threat of something else. I'll kill your kids, I'll do this to other people that you love, unless you do this. Does the note indicate suicidal intent? Suicide notes oftentimes have mixed emotional content, including positive and negative feelings. Suicide ideations, which are the formation and conception of ideas in the mind of the deceased, present suicide as a viable option. There may be reference to an afterlife, or being with a loved one looking down, etc. The suicide note is a direct communication indicating intent to commit suicide. The letters and notes may be addressed to relatives and friends or left at the death scene, which indicates severe depression and/or anger. The notes are often coherent and legible unless written under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and may be instructional and/or admonishing. These notes should be collected in a manner to preserve any latent fingerprints, and exemplars should be obtained for comparison. The note oftentimes provides a basis of inquiry into the background of the deceased. Hence the reason there is no note for Cornell, there is no note for Bennington, there is no note for Bourdain, because a comparison can be done. Not even written text on a computer. And if the notes were taken in hopes of an insurance payout, they were all ruled suicide anyway, but that's what they wanted. Anyway. Mistake number 7, failure to take each factor to its ultimate conclusion. In order to conduct an efficient and effective investigation, the detective first concentrates on the mechanical aspects of the death, i.e. motives and methods, wound structures, crime scene reconstruction, blood stain pattern analysis, or puddles of blood on the floor, blood spatter on the side of a tub, in a hanging, a suicide hanging. That don't happen, people. That's bullshit. Unless the person falls and hits themselves, and that would leave a wound that would easily be, detectable on a medical examiner's investigation. When they look at the body, there was no wound on Chris that could have produced blood. What does that tell you? Motives and methods, wound structures, crime scene reconstruction, blood stain pattern analysis, the cause, manner, and time of death, as well as other factors that provide clues to the dynamics of the event. The detective then accesses various sources which can be applied to his or her investigation. In suicide cases, the application of a psychological autopsy might be useful in drawing conclusions, but only if the information obtained for this instrument is taken concurrent with the event and not after people have formulated an opinion. Remember, do it right the first time. You only get one chance. Quote from Lieutenant Commander Vernon J. Gebert from 1980 in Law and Order magazine. Conclusion. It should be noted the final determination of suicide is made by the medical examiner coroner after all the facts are evaluated. However, the investigation at the scene and an inquiry into the background of the deceased may indicate the presence of life-threatening behavior or activities that suggest suicidal intent. Of course, the medical examiner coroner is supposed to avail him or her of the input of the investigators who were present at the scene and conducted the death investigation. Well, this is an excellent forensics lesson and how to properly handle a death scene if there aren't any payoffs involved. And remember, we offer commercial-free content here and ideas, theories, and theses that no one else can give you. So please, hit the PayPal. Please help support this. Check out my live stream link if you would like to see me on live stream. Please contribute ideas, comments. Please hit the like button if you like the video. Please subscribe if you enjoy the content. Only we can keep this going. Peace be ever with thee.